The Invisible Man starring Elizabeth Moss was the last film that many saw in theaters before the COVID shutdowns, or one of the first they saw at home right after. What many don't know is that the character of the Invisible Man came from the very first interconnected cinematic universe established way back in the 1930s, the Universal Monsters. The Universal Monster movies were some of the first sequels ever made in Hollywood, and as they introduced more characters, eventually those characters crossed paths in other movies. Flash forward to 2020, when The Invisible Man became the first of many low-budget horror movies that Blumhouse Productions is making to add contemporary teeth to these classic tales. So sit back for a history of the monster movies and a little intel on what's coming next for this monster partnership. In 1931, Dracula became the first Universal monster talkie.
I am Dracula.
Those words were spoken by Bela Lugosi, and though Bram Stoker's Count was Lugosi's most famous character, Universal used different actors for 3 films in the 40s, Lon Chaney Jr. and John Carradine. But much more on Chaney later.
Conversation. The guy growls like a wolf.
Carradine played the Transylvanian bloodsucker in Dracula's first crossover films, first in House of Frankenstein in 1944, and then in House of Dracula in 1945. Each film featured both Frankenstein's monster and Count Dracula. But it was Lugosi's Dracula who met Abbott and Costello in 1948, the first of a series of films where a monster meets Abbott and Costello and comedy ensues. Yes, meets, not versus. Oh, the stakes in a crossover movie were so different back then.
Count Dracula sleeps in this coffin, but rises every night at sunset. Chick is right. This is awful silly stuff.
It'd be 31 years before Universal would raise their iconic character from his coffin again. Frank Langella played the seductive and sinister vampire in 1979's Dracula. Langella was called the sexiest vampire to nibble on screen, which perhaps explains the more seductive vampire stories that would emerge afterwards. Back to the original 1931 Dracula. This didn't just introduce the world to horror icon Bela Lugosi, but also to the character of scientist vampire hunter Van Helsing. Edward Van Sloan, who played Helsing, would reprise the Slayer in the Dracula-less sequel, Dracula's Daughter, in 1936. In the next century, Universal attempted to create a franchise for Hugh Jackman in the role in 2004, with Richard Roxburgh playing Dracula. Though that potential franchise starter stalled, the character did get his own TV series, which has aired since 2016 on Sci-Fi.
Why is it so important to kill this Dracula anyway?
Because he's the son of the devil.
I mean, besides that.
Dracula himself would get his own 21st century reboot in Dracula Untold, an origin tale for Vlad the Impaler that made the vampire more of a warrior than previous versions. This film was released in a cycle of Universal monster movies released in the aughts that focused more on action than horror. With the successful partnership between Universal and Blumhouse on the cheaper and more grounded Invisible Man, Dracula is already set to get a new makeover from Jennifer Body's director Karin Kusama, who will bring the classic character into our modern world. I'd be careful finding virgin blood, Vlad.
With the deepest malice, we deliver this virgin unto thee.
Released in the same year as Dracula, James Whale's Frankenstein used the stage adaptation of Mary Shelley's classic book for the basis of its film, the same approach that Universal had done for Dracula, to ease the adaptation process and start filming right away. Lugosi actually filmed tests as the monster right after filming Dracula on the very same set. Lugosi eventually turned down the role because it didn't have enough dialogue. Enter Boris Karloff. Karloff was the iconic performance of Frankenstein's monster, and Karloff played the role 3 times between 1931 and 1939.
Friend?
But it was actor Glenn Strange who played Frankenstein in all the crossover films opposite Dracula and Abbott and Costello. In between turning down the chance to play Frankenstein's monster and then later playing him in Frankenstein Meets the Wolfman, Lugosi played the hunchback blacksmith Igor in 2 Frankenstein films, Son of Frankenstein and The Ghost of Frankenstein. As Igor, he not only got to rise from the dead, but he did get more lines than the monster.
They die dead. I die live.
The Hunchback's lab assistant that many parody films such as Young Frankenstein would dub Igor was actually named Fritz in the 1931 Frankenstein and did not appear in the novel but was created for the first play adaptation. In the original film, Karloff isn't listed in the opening credits as playing the monster. Instead, a question mark stands in its place, a callback to the way the actor who played the monster was credited in the playbill for the first Frankenstein stage production in 1823.
It's alive! It's alive! It's alive! In the name of God! Now I know what it feels like to be God!
Similar to Dracula, Frankenstein would have numerous Hammer films made in Britain in the 1950s through the 1970s, and though there were a handful of new Frankenstein films in the 21st century, the classic Universal monster hasn't been featured in a Universal property since Meeting Abbott and Costello in 1948. However, Universal is currently sitting on numerous potential Frankenstein movies. One is a potential adaptation from producer James Wan concerning neighborhood kids who discover that their neighbor is attempting to build a human in his basement. And both John Krasinski and Angelina Jolie have attempted to get a version of The Bride of Frankenstein off the lab table, which no doubt would feature the bride more than the mere 5 minutes that Elsa Lanchester created one of horror's most iconic characters in. After the opening of King Tut's tomb in 1922, Universal hoped to purchase an existing work about an ancient mummy's curse. However, one to the studio's liking wasn't found, and thus 1932's The Mummy became the first original Universal monster movie. Boris Karloff played Imhotep, and though he was credited as a question mark in Frankenstein, he became an overnight sensation, and thus the following year his credit for his next monster movie was in all caps Karloff. Despite being a success, this Mummy had no direct sequels, the only such film from the classic 30s introductory movies to do so. Still, there were 5 Universal movies that featured a different Egyptian mummy, Charis, who was played 4 times by, once again, Lon Chaney Jr. It was the Charis mummy that met Abbott and Costello, which was the final Abbott and Costello meets such and such monster movie. So that was a wrap on 2 Universal franchises. Imhotep wouldn't rise again until Brendan Fraser and Rachel Weisz came knocking on his tomb in 1999. Stephen Sommers' Indiana Jones-style action, comedy, mystical hybrid was the first Universal monster remake in 2 decades. The Fraser-Weisz-led movies were so successful they spawned a trilogy of new films, including a spin-off, The Scorpion King, and an animated television series. The introduction to the Scorpion King in 2001's The Mummy Returns marked the acting debut of Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, and his standalone spin-off movie in 2002 became the former wrestler's first leading role. All told, this cycle of films from 1999 to 2008 made $1.4 billion at the worldwide box office. With that coin, it's no wonder Universal went back to The Mummy when trying to launch a new interconnected monster universe. However, the Tom Cruise action vehicle went up against Wonder Woman, a beloved character who hadn't yet had her own mega movie, let alone a reboot, and the movie that was supposed to launch a new interconnected universe of films failed on its first announced try. Goodbye Russell Crowe's Jekyll and Hyde, Javier Bardem's Frankenstein monster, and Johnny Depp's Invisible Man. It was a different version of The Invisible Man that was made on a tiny $7 million budget that would reset the course of the modern Universal monster movies, but more on that in a minute. Let's again travel back to the 1930s. Claude Rains received the role of the Invisible Man at the insistence of the director James Whale because Rains' voice was so distinct, which was the most important part of his performance.
Brought it on yourselves. Everything would have come right if you'd only left me alone.
Based on the H.G. Wells novel, the 1933 film was a pioneer of many practical effects. When the Invisible Man was completely invisible, wires were pulled to knock over items. When he had some articles of clothing on but was otherwise invisible, this effect was achieved by having Rains wear a black velvet suit and perform against a black backdrop. Then the backdrop would be filmed naturally and the shots were combined using a matte process. And yes, he met Abbott and Costello too. More than 60 years after meeting Abbott and Costello, Johnny Depp would be announced to play the Invisible Man, though after Tom Cruise's Mummy, that film remained invisible. However, in 2019, Universal announced it would team up with Blumhouse Productions, producers of inexpensive but provocative horror films such as Get Out and The Purge, to field director and character-driven pitches on reinventing monster stories from their back catalog. The first to go into production was Leigh Whannell's Invisible Man. This Invisible Man was told from the point of view of his victim, played by Elizabeth Moss, in a timely tale about domestic violence and victims' testimonies going unchecked by police. Making 4 times its budget back on its opening weekend alone, The Invisible Man was the last success at the box office before COVID-19 caused theaters to temporarily shut down. There's a sequel planned to the hit 2020 film, and also a separate film from Elizabeth Banks, The Invisible Woman, which the Pitch Perfect 2 director pitched after pulling from Universal's character vaults. Lon Chaney's father played the very first Universal monster in the silent film The Phantom of the Opera, and Lon Chaney Jr. played not just the Wolfman, but also Frankenstein's monster, the Mummy, and Dracula. So the Chaney men played 5 of the original 7 classic monsters. Universal, however, credited Jr. in the first monster movies, including the Wolfman, with his father's name, Lon Chaney, even though his father had passed away in 1930. The look of the Wolfman was actually created by Jack Pierce for a previous Universal werewolf movie, 1935's Werewolf of London, but the star of the film, Howard Hall, didn't approve because he was too unrecognizable in the makeup, and so it went unused. Chaney, however, preferred the look, and the rest is history. The Wolfman screenwriter Kurt Siodmak created the lore of the silver bullet being what could stop a werewolf. His inspiration was hearing the term silver bullet in a Lone Ranger radio program, and he just liked the sound of it. Siodmak also wrote the quote-unquote ancient poem about werewolves that features in the 1941 film and the 2010 remake. Benicio del Toro portrayed the Wolfman in the 2010 film, though it wasn't his first appearance in human canine makeup, as his first movie role was Duke the Dog-Faced Boy in Pee Wee Herman's Big Top Pee-Wee. The effects-heavy film did not earn back its budget, but it did set the template of how monster movies would be made in that decade, heavy on effects and action. The Wolfman is next in line to get the Blumhouse remake treatment, however with a modern setting and low budget from the director of The Invisible Man, Leigh Whannell. Ryan Gosling is set to howl at the moon for Whannell, but the actor will do more than don makeup, as the story pitch for the remake came from him.
He doesn't tell me what to do.
He just told you what to do.
I know, I let him.
The last monster introduced during the classic Universal monster years was the creature from the Black Lagoon. The project actually originated at a Citizen Kane dinner party. No, the creature isn't named Rosebud, but an actor in the film, William Alland, was told the story of a half-man, half-reptile that haunted the Amazon River at an Orson Welles dinner party. More than a decade later, Alland was producing the creature from the Black Lagoon based on that conversation. The creature design actually came from an Oscar statuette, as the director, Jack Arnold, had recently been nominated for an Oscar for Best Documentary and looked at his certificate and added gills and webbed hands and decided that that was the creature. The creature's final brush with prestige was Oscar again, except this time it was missed. Guillermo del Toro pitched his auteur take on reviving the creature from the Black Lagoon to Universal, but the studio passed. That original pitch was retooled and eventually became the Best Picture winning The Shape of Water. Scarlett Johansson was rumored to be cast in a reboot back in 2015, though nothing ever materialized. With Universal and Blumhouse taking pitches from many directors on their monster movies, a return to the Amazon could be booked at some point. Or did Del Toro's Oscar win push Creature further down the river? What's your favorite classic Universal monster? And which remake are you looking forward to the most? Let us know in the comments below.